The silence in the church was a living thing. It grew heavier with each beat of Aurelia's heart, a monstrous weight pressing down on her shoulders, threatening to crush the delicate lace of her wedding veil. She stood at the altar, a statue carved from hope and ivory, and waited. The scent of lilies and old stone filled her lungs, a perfume of endings rather than beginnings. She had been waiting for 20 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime had passed since the organist's hopeful chords had faded into this thick, expectant hush. Her fiancé, Lord Julian Beaumont, was late. It was not entirely a surprise. Julian moved through life on a tide of his own whims, a charming, careless man who treated punctuality as a suggestion rather than a requirement. Aurelia had accepted this, just as she had accepted the marriage itself, a transaction dressed in silk and promises. Her family needed the Beaumont connection to save them from ruin, and she was the price. She had resigned herself to a life of managing Julian's casual affections and more casual debts, a future that felt like a long, grey road stretching into mist. But this was different. This was not merely late, this was a spectacle. She could feel the eyes of the ton upon her, hundreds of pairs of eyes, their gazes like tiny sharp pins pricking her skin. Whispers began to bloom in the pews, soft and venomous, like moss creeping over the ancient stones. She kept her own eyes fixed on the stained glass window above the altar, a depiction of a saint ascending to heaven. She felt rather more like she was descending into hell. Her father, standing beside her, shifted his weight. His hand, tucked in the crook of her arm, was slick with sweat. He was a man watching his last gamble fail. She felt a tremor run through him as a young footman scurried up the side aisle and pressed a folded note into the hand of the vicar. The vicar's face, already pale, turned the colour of ash. He exchanged a look with her father, a silent, devastating conversation that took only a second. The truth fell upon Aurelia not with a crash, but with a sickening, slow certainty. He was not coming. Julian, with his easy smile and thoughtless promises, had left her here, alone, in front of everyone. The humiliation was a physical force, a hot wave that washed over her, making her skin burn and her blood run cold. The whispers grew louder, no longer bothering to conceal themselves. Words like jilted and heiress and Gretna Green reached her, sharp little darts of gossip. She thought her life was over. In that moment, it truly was. The life of Lady Aurelia, future Baroness, was finished. All that remained was the ruin. Her family's financial collapse would now be accompanied by a social obliteration from which they would never recover. She felt a strange, hollow calm settle over her. There was nothing left to fear when the worst had already happened. Then, a movement from the front pew caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the others. The Duke of Blackwood, Alistair Beaumont, rose to his feet. He was Julian's older brother, a man as different from his sibling as stone is from sea foam. Where Julian was golden and bright, Alistair was dark and severe. He was a figure of immense power and wealth, a man who rarely spoke and never smiled, whose presence was so formidable it seemed to suck the very air from a room. He had been a silent observer at all the pre-nuptial events, his dark, unreadable eyes following her in a way that had been deeply unsettling. He walked down the aisle, his steps measured and silent on the stone flags. The whispers died instantly, strangled by his approach. Every eye in the church followed him. He stopped before the altar, his height casting a long shadow over her. He looked not at her, but at her father, and then at the stricken vicar. His voice, when it came, was low and devoid of emotion, yet it carried to every corner of the cavernous space. "There will be a wedding today," he stated. It was not a question, it was a command. Her father gaped, speechless. The vicar fumbled with the forgotten note in his hands. Alistair's gaze finally fell upon her. For the first time, she saw something flicker in the depths of his dark eyes, an emotion she could not name. It was not pity, it was something fiercer, more complex. "I will take my brother's place," he said. A collective gasp swept through the congregation. The silence that followed was absolute, a void of pure shock. Aurelia stared at him, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. The Duke of Blackwood, a man who could have any woman in England, was offering to marry her? The publicly shamed, financially destitute woman his own brother had just discarded. It made no sense. It was an act of madness, or of the most profound, inexplicable pity she had ever witnessed. Her father, recovering his senses, began to stammer his gratitude, his relief a pathetic, trembling thing. But the Duke did not look at him. His eyes remained locked on Aurelia's. He was waiting for her answer. She, the ruined bride, was being given a choice. It was a choice between complete annihilation and this bizarre, unnerving salvation. She looked into the hard planes of his face, at the unyielding line of his jaw. He was offering her a lifeline, but it felt like a cage of a different sort. Still, it was better than the abyss. Her voice was a thread, barely audible. "I accept," she whispered. The rest of the ceremony was a surreal dream. The vicar, his voice shaking, amended the vows. Names were swapped. Aurelia floated through it, her hand resting on Alastair's arm. His touch was firm, steady, but gave no warmth. He felt like a marble statue, beautiful and cold. When he slid the ring onto her finger, a heavy gold band that had been meant for his brother to give, his fingers were cool and impersonal. She was a duchess. The title felt like a costume she was wearing, ill-fitting and absurd. They walked back down the aisle through a sea of stunned, silent faces. No one threw rice. No one cheered. They simply watched as the silent Duke led his jilted bride out of the church and into a new, bewildering life. The carriage ride to his estate was conducted in near total silence. Aurelia sat opposite him, her hands clenched in the lap of her now useless wedding gown. She stared out the window at the rolling countryside, the green hills a blur of colour. She could feel his gaze on her, but could not bring herself to meet it. What could she possibly say? "Thank you for saving me from utter ruin?" It seemed woefully inadequate. "Why did you do it?" The question burned in her mind, but she dared not ask. She was his property now, a bargain struck in a moment of crisis. She had no right to question his motives. Blackwood Manor rose from the landscape like a jagged piece of the sky had fallen to earth. It was a formidable Gothic structure of dark grey stone, all sharp angles and imposing towers, surrounded by ancient, brooding trees. It was not a home. It was a fortress, a place designed to keep the world out. It suited him perfectly. The staff lined the entrance hall, their faces carefully neutral as their new master and his unexpected duchess entered. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, stepped forward. "Your Grace," she said, her voice crisp. "Welcome home. We were not expecting. That is, preparations have been made for the Duchess." "See to them," Alastair said, his voice clipped. He turned to Aurelia. "You will be shown to your rooms. I have matters to attend to." He gave a stiff, formal bow and was gone, his footsteps echoing down a long, dark corridor. Aurelia was left standing in the vast, cold hall, feeling smaller and more lost than she had at the altar. Mrs. Gable led her up a grand, sweeping staircase and down a wing of the house that was clearly separate from the master's. The rooms were opulent, furnished with heavy, dark wood and rich tapestries, but they were also impersonal and cold. A fire had been lit in the hearth, but it did little to chase away the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. Her lady's maid, a young girl named Clara, who had come with her from home, helped her out of the wedding dress. The girl's eyes were wide, with a mixture of fear and awe. As Aurelia sank into a chair in a simple dressing gown, the weight of the day finally descended upon her. She was married, to a man she did not know. A man who had married her out of what could only be a sense of familial duty, a public relations maneuver to mitigate the scandal his brother had caused. Her new life had begun. It was a life of gilded emptiness, of silent dinners and long, lonely days in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. The first week was a study in polite avoidance. She and Alistair shared meals in a dining hall so vast their voices seemed to get lost on the way to the ceiling. Their conversation was stilted, limited to pleasantries about the weather or the food. He would inquire if she was comfortable, if she had everything she needed. She would murmur that she was, and that she did. Then silence would fall again, thick and suffocating. She spent her days exploring the castle and its grounds. She found a library that took her breath away, a 2-story cathedral of books with towering shelves and a rolling ladder. She lost herself in its aisles, the scent of old paper and leather a comfort. It was here she felt the first crack in his formidable armor. Tucked away on a small reading table near a window overlooking the gardens was a first edition of a collection of botanical sketches she had once mentioned admiring during a brief, formal conversation weeks before the wedding. It was not a book Julian would have ever noticed or remembered. Had Alistair put it there for her? The thought was absurd. It had to be a coincidence. She took to sketching in the gardens, a neglected but beautiful space with a crumbling stone wall and roses that grew wild and tangled. One afternoon, she was so absorbed in capturing the delicate curl of a petal that she didn't hear him approach. "You have a talent," his voice said from behind her. She jumped, her charcoal pencil skittering across the page. He stood a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. He was not dressed in his usual severe, formal attire, but in a simple linen shirt and riding breeches. It made him look younger, less intimidating. "Your Grace," she stammered, closing her sketchbook. "You startled me." "My apologies," he said, though his tone was as flat as ever. He gestured toward the book. "May I?" Hesitantly, she handed it to him. He turned the pages slowly, his expression unreadable. He paused on a sketch he had made of the library, another of a small, frightened-looking bird that had flown into a window pane. He said nothing for a long time. She found herself holding her breath. "My mother enjoyed painting," he said at last, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "There is a studio in the North Tower. It has not been used in years. It has the best light. You are welcome to it if you wish." He handed the sketchbook back to her, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. His touch was warm. It was a small thing, a brief, accidental contact, but it sent a strange jolt through her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He gave a curt nod and walked away, leaving her with a rapidly beating heart and a profound sense of confusion. Pity did not extend to finding old art studios. Duty did not involve remembering a passing comment about a book. Who was this man, this silent, watchful duke who seemed to see things no one else did? A few days later, her mother came to visit. Lady Ashworth arrived in a flurry of anxiety and lace, her face a mask of worried sympathy. They sat in one of the grand, cold drawing rooms, the tea service between them untouched. "Oh, my dearest Aurelia," her mother began, her voice trembling. "How are you bearing up? This house, it is so grim. And the Duke, he is formidable. Is he treating you well? I confess, I have not slept a wink for worrying." "They say he has a heart of stone." "He is perfectly civil, Mother," Aurelia replied, her tone more defensive than she intended. "He has been considerate." "Considerate?" her mother scoffed delicately. "A man marries you at the altar where his own brother abandoned you, and considerate is the word you use. Aurelia, This is not a marriage. It is a penance. You must be careful. Men like that, men with such power and so little warmth, they can be cruel in ways you cannot imagine." Her mother's words were meant to be a warning, but they had the opposite effect. They solidified a strange, fledgling sense of loyalty Aurelia was beginning to feel toward her husband. He was not cruel. He was quiet. He was distant. But he was not cruel. He had given her a library, a garden, and a studio. Julian would have given her debts and a headache. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another guest, announced by a flustered-looking butler. Lady Seraphina Croft swept into the room, a vision in emerald green silk. She was a renowned beauty, and it was widely known she had set her sights on the Duke of Blackwood long before Aurelia had ever appeared on the scene. Her smile was as sharp and bright as broken glass. "Duchess," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she curtsied, "and Lady Ashworth, how lovely to see you both. I simply had to call and see how you were settling in. It must be such a change for you." Her eyes raked over Aurelia, taking in her simple day dress with a look of disdain. "Lady Seraphina," Aurelia acknowledged, her voice cool. "How kind of you to call." The visit was an exercise in veiled insults. Lady Seraphina spoke at length about the Duke's solitary nature, his distaste for social gatherings, and his impeccable, if exacting, tastes. The implication was clear. Aurelia was none of those things. She was a provincial nobody, a second-hand bride who could never hope to meet his standards. "One does wonder what a man like the Duke wants with a wife at all," Seraphina mused, stirring her tea. "Especially one acquired in such hasty circumstances. It was an act of charity, of course, terribly noble of him, but charity can be such a burden over time, can it not?" Aurelia's teacup rattled in its saucer. Her mother looked horrified. Before Aurelia could formulate a reply, a low voice cut through the tension from the doorway. "I find my wife to be no burden at all." Alastair stood there, his presence filling the room, extinguishing the light chatter like a snuffer on a candle. He had approached so silently, none of them had heard him. His eyes were fixed on Lady Seraphina, and they were as cold and hard as chips of flint. Lady Seraphina paled. "Your Grace, we were having a little chat." "So I heard," he said, his voice dangerously soft. He walked to Aurelia's side, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. The gesture was possessive, protective, and entirely shocking. "Lady Seraphina, my wife and I value our privacy. I trust you will remember that in the future." He did not raise his voice, but the dismissal was absolute. It was a command to leave, and it was not open to negotiation. Humiliation warred with fury on Seraphina's beautiful face. She stood abruptly, her poise shattered. "Of course, Your Grace," she managed to say through gritted teeth. She shot Aurelia a look of pure venom before practically fleeing the room. Her mother, flustered and intimidated, made her own excuses and departed soon after, leaving Aurelia alone with her husband. The drawing-room was silent again, but this was a different kind of silence. It was charged, electric. Alastair's hand was still on her shoulder, a warm, heavy weight that seemed to anchor her. She turned to look up at him. "Thank you," she said. "She will not bother you again," he replied, his gaze intense. His hand dropped from her shoulder, and she felt its absence immediately. He looked as if he were about to say more, but then he seemed to think better of it. He gave her another of his stiff, formal bows and left her alone. Aurelia stood there for a long time, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had not just defended her honor, he had claimed her. In front of her mother, in front of his would-be paramour, he had called her my wife, and touched her with a familiarity that belied their strange, distant arrangement. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Men like that can be cruel. But what she had just witnessed was not cruelty. It was a fierce, quiet protection that left her breathless. The mystery of her husband had deepened, and with it, a terrifying, exhilarating flicker of something that felt dangerously like hope. The incident with Lady Seraphina was a turning point. The carefully constructed walls of politeness between them began to crumble, not all at once, but brick by brick. He started seeking her out, joining her for walks in the garden or sitting in silence with her in the library while she read. He never said much, but his presence was a comfort, a steady, reassuring weight in the vast emptiness of the house. She began to see the man beneath the title. She noticed the way his brow furrowed when he was concentrating on estate papers, the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes that he could not quite hide. She saw him speak to his stable master with a quiet respect, and watched him calm a spooked horse with a gentle hand and a low murmur. He was a man burdened by duty, isolated by his power, and, she was beginning to suspect, deeply lonely. The North Tower studio was just as he had described. It was a large, airy room with a vaulted ceiling and a massive arched window that flooded the space with soft, northern light. It was dusty and draped in white cloths, a ghost of a room left behind by a ghost of a woman. As she and Clara pulled away the sheets, they uncovered easels, canvases, and tables laden with pots of dried-up paints and brittle brushes. In a corner, covered by a particularly large cloth, was a finished portrait. It was of a woman with Alastair's dark hair and a sad, gentle smile. His mother, the Duchess he had spoken of so briefly. She was beautiful, but there was a fragility to her, a melancholy in her eyes that Aurelia recognized in her son. She felt a pang of sympathy for the boy he must have been, growing up in this severe house with a sad mother and a careless, charming brother who surely soaked up all the light. She spent hours in that studio, cleaning it, organizing it, making it her own. Alastair had fresh supplies sent up without her even having to ask. It became her sanctuary, a place where she could be herself, not the Duchess, not the jilted bride, but simply Aurelia. She began to paint again, not just sketches, but vibrant landscapes of the wild gardens and the moody skies over Blackwood. Colour returned to her life, both on the canvas and within her. It was on the evening of their 3-week anniversary, a strange milestone she hadn't even realized she was counting, that everything changed. She had been working late in the studio, trying to capture the last rays of the sunset, when he appeared in the doorway. He was holding a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. "I thought you might be thirsty," he said, his voice quiet. She smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. "I am. Thank you." He poured them each a glass, and they stood by the great window, watching the sky bleed from orange and pink into a deep, bruised purple. The silence between them was comfortable now, familiar, but tonight it felt different, heavier with unspoken things. She had to know. She had to understand. The not knowing was a constant low hum beneath the surface of her new life. She turned to him, gathering all her courage. "Your Grace," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "Alastair, I must ask you something." He turned to face her, his expression guarded. "Anything?" "Why?" she asked simply. "Why did you do it? Why did you marry me?" She held his gaze, refusing to look away. "Please, do not tell me it was for duty, or to protect the family name. I have seen the way you are. That is not the whole truth. I deserve to know the whole truth." He was silent for a long time, his jaw tight. He stared out the window at the encroaching darkness. She thought for a moment he would not answer, that he would retreat back behind his wall of silence. But then he let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound weariness. "You are right," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't place. It was not for duty. He took a sip of his wine, his knuckles white where he gripped the glass. It was for me. He finally looked at her, and the mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw a vulnerability that stunned her, a raw, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. "I have loved you for 3 years, Aurelia," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The words hung in the air between them, impossibly heavy, impossibly fragile. Aurelia felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of his confession. 3 years? But we barely spoke. I didn't even think you knew my name. I knew everything about you, he said, a bitter, self-deprecating smile touching his lips for the first time. I saw you for the first time at the Danbury ball. You were standing by the ferns, arguing with your father about a book of poetry. Everyone else was laughing and dancing, and you were standing in the shadows, fiercely defending something you loved. You were magnificent. He told her everything. He had watched her from afar for years, admiring her intelligence, her quiet strength, her resilience in a world that sought to diminish her. He had wanted to approach her, but he felt he had nothing to offer. He saw himself as he thought the world saw him, cold, severe, twice her age, a man buried under the weight of a title. What could he offer a woman like her but a life of shadow and silence? "And then Julian noticed you," he continued, his voice laced with old pain. "My brother, who has everything I do not, charm, ease, laughter. He pursued you, and I watched. It was a torment. I knew he was not good enough for you. I knew he would not appreciate you, that he saw you as another beautiful acquisition. But he was making you smile, and I did nothing." He confessed that he had known for a week that Julian planned to elope with the shipping heiress. His brother, drowning in gambling debts, had come to him for money. Alistair had given it to him, but on one condition, that Julian leave the country and never return. He had effectively paid his own brother to abandon her at the altar. "It was a monstrous thing to do," Alistair said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "I manipulated the situation. I ensured your public humiliation so that I could be the one to save you. I used your desperation, your family's ruin, to trap you. It was not noble. It was the act of a desperate, cowardly man who saw his only chance and seized it, no matter the cost to you." He stood before her, the powerful Duke of Blackwood, utterly exposed. He was not a savior. He was a man who had orchestrated her downfall to possess her. A cold fury should have risen in her. She should have felt betrayed, used. But as she looked at him, at the agony in his eyes, all she felt was a profound, overwhelming wave of empathy. He hadn't seen a pawn to be manipulated. He had seen her. For 3 years, while she had felt invisible, he had been watching. While she had resigned herself to a loveless marriage, he had been in agony. All the small, confusing acts of kindness suddenly snapped into focus. The book, the studio, his defense against Lady Seraphina. They were not random gestures. They were the quiet, clumsy attempts of a silent man to show his love. "You were not the only one who was desperate," she said softly. Her own voice trembled. "I was marrying your brother to save my family. I was resigned to a life without love, without being truly seen. I felt as trapped as you did." She stepped closer to him, closing the space between them. "You say you are a coward, Alistair, but the man I have come to know these past 3 weeks is not a coward. He is quiet and kind and fiercely protective. He gave me a library and a sanctuary. He saw a talent in me that I had forgotten I possessed." She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. He flinched, as if expecting a blow. "You did not trap me," she said, her gaze holding his. "You freed me." He stared at her, his dark eyes searching hers, filled with a desperate, dawning hope. He slowly raised a hand, his fingers shaking slightly, and brushed a stray curl from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, reverent. In that moment, she made her choice. Not as the Duchess accepting her fate, but as Aurelia, a woman choosing her own future. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of acceptance. It was a soft, gentle meeting, a silent promise. It tasted of wine and unspoken sorrows and the beginning of something new. When they finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, and she reached up to wipe it away. The formidable Duke of Blackwood was weeping. "Aurelia." He breathed her name like a prayer. "Alistair," she whispered back. The cold stone of Blackwood Manor no longer felt like a prison. For the first time, it felt like home. Section 2 years passed. The transformation of Blackwood Manor was a reflection of the transformation within its walls. The heavy velvet drapes were replaced with lighter fabrics that let the sunshine stream in. The wild, tangled gardens were now carefully tended, bursting with colour and life. Laughter, a sound the ancient stones had not heard in a generation, was now a common occurrence, echoing down the long corridors. Aurelia's studio in the North Tower was her domain, filled with canvases that captured the changing seasons of her new life. There were paintings of the gardens, of the misty hills, and several of a dark-haired man who was often caught smiling. A subtle, private expression reserved only for the artist. Alistair was a changed man. The weight of his loneliness had been lifted, replaced by a quiet joy that softened the severe lines of his face. He was still the formidable Duke to the outside world, but within the walls of his home, he was simply Alistair. He spent his evenings not with ledgers and estate papers, but in the library with his wife, reading aloud to her or simply sitting in comfortable silence, their hands intertwined. One bright summer afternoon, Aurelia sat on a blanket in the garden, a sketchbook open in her lap. She was not sketching the roses, however. She was sketching the small, dark-haired boy who was taking his first wobbly steps across the lawn. Her son, Arthur. He stumbled and fell onto the soft grass with a surprised giggle. Before she could move, Alistair was there, scooping the boy up into his arms and tossing him gently into the air. Arthur shrieked with delight, his tiny hands grabbing at his father's hair. Alistair's face was alight with a love so pure and profound it made Aurelia's heart ache with happiness. He caught her watching him and smiled that rare, beautiful smile that still made her breath catch. He walked over and sat on the blanket beside her, settling their son between them. Arthur immediately crawled into his mother's lap, babbling contentedly. "He has your eyes," Alistair said softly, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. "And he has your stubborn determination," she replied, laughing as Arthur made a grab for her charcoal pencil. They sat there for a long time, a family bathed in the warm afternoon sun. The memory of that dreadful day in the church felt like a story from another lifetime, something that had happened to two different people. Her greatest humiliation had become her most profound blessing. She had been left at the altar by a boy who offered a life of shallow charm, only to be claimed by a man who offered a love as deep and enduring as the stones of the castle they now called home. She had learned that a person's worth is not defined by society's judgment or the circumstances of their birth. It is defined by the quiet moments, by the steadfast love of a person who sees you when no one else is looking. Love, she had discovered, was not always a sudden bright flame. Sometimes it was a patient, steady glow that had been waiting in the shadows all along, ready to lead you out of the darkness and into the light. Her life had not ended at that altar. It had finally, truly, begun.